The ballroom shimmered with golden light, spilling from crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls above the polished marble floor. Waiters in white gloves glided between guests, balancing trays of champagne that caught and reflected the glow. The air was thick with perfume, polite laughter, and the quiet hum of wealth. Near the center of the room, a glossy white grand piano stood like a jewel on display, its surface so pristine it seemed untouched. Seated beside it, in a gown the color of midnight, was the young heiress, her family's fortune written in every diamond at her throat, and in the easy way she commanded the room's attention. Surrounded by friends in designer dresses and tailored suits, she leaned back against the piano bench, a playful smile dancing on her lips. She wasn't just beautiful, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. The conversation at her table was light and teasing, full of harmless dares and flamboyant boasts, until she suddenly placed one manicured hand on the polished keys, drawing a soft, almost mocking chord from the instrument. "If anyone here can play this piece perfectly," she announced in a voice that cut through the chatter, "I'll marry them." Her friends erupted into laughter, their voices ringing out across the ballroom. A few men grinned and shook their heads, while others made exaggerated gestures of surrender. Everyone knew it was a joke, one meant to showcase the impossibly rare sheet music propped on the piano stand, a piece so notoriously difficult that even trained pianists avoided it. The heiress's challenge wasn't about finding a husband, it was about reminding everyone that the piano, like everything else in the room, was a symbol of her world, a world where beauty, wealth, and talent existed for display. Across the room, by the grand staircase, a teenage girl in plain clothes paused mid-step. She was clutching a rag and a spray bottle, having been quietly cleaning the railing. She looked nothing like the women in sparkling gowns or the men in tuxedos. Her hair was tied back simply, and her shoes were scuffed from hours of work. She wasn't there as a guest, she was the janitor's daughter, helping her father with his evening shift to earn a little extra money. She tried to turn away, to focus on her work, but her ears caught the faint echo of the piano's notes. Her gaze drifted back, and there it was, shimmering under the ballroom's light, the instrument she had only ever dreamed of playing. Her heart beat faster. She could hear the heiress's friends still laughing, teasing one another about the ridiculous challenge. It wasn't just the joke that caught her attention, it was the piece itself. She recognized it instantly. She had studied its complex notes for years, not on a grand piano like this one, but on an old, battered upright that sat in her family's storage room, its keys chipped, its strings out of tune. The sound of the room seemed to fade for her. She wasn't thinking about the glittering crowd, the champagne, or the expensive gowns. All she could think of was the way the melody felt under her fingers, the way it came alive when played with heart instead of pride. She didn't know if she had the courage to step forward, but something inside her stirred, a pull toward the keys, a voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, this was her moment. The laughter still lingered in the air like the faint chime of crystal glasses. Guests returned to their conversations, some exchanging knowing smirks about the heiress's little performance. The girl by the staircase, however, stood frozen in place. Her rag hung limply in one hand, the spray bottle dangling from the other, as if she had forgotten entirely why she was there. Every instinct told her to keep her head down. Her father had always warned her that in rooms like this, people didn't see her. At best, she was invisible, at worst, she was an intruder. And yet, her gaze kept drifting toward the piano. She could see the neat rows of ivory and ebony, the soft gleam of the pedals, and the delicate notations on the sheet music. Each mark, each rest, each note was as familiar to her as the freckles on her own hands. She knew this piece by heart, had traced the shapes of those very notes in the dim light of her family's cramped living room. Her late mother, a music teacher before life had turned hard, had spent years drilling it into her fingers, always telling her, don't just play the notes, play the story inside them. Something in her chest tightened, a mix of longing and the sting of memories. She thought of her mother's voice, of the evenings they spent together leaning over the old, battered piano, its surface etched with scratches and water stains. She thought of how she had kept practicing even after her mother's passing, how she would slip into the storage room after finishing her homework and lose herself in the music, her fingers flying over keys that stuck or refused to sound at all. Now here it was, the same piece, the same challenge, but on a piano worth more than her family's entire home. And here she was, standing in a gownless shadow among glittering guests who wouldn't think twice about stepping around her. Her stomach churned with both fear and excitement. She told herself it was ridiculous. What would they say if she walked up there? What would the heiress do? Probably laugh. Probably dismiss her before she could even touch a key. Still, her feet began to move before her mind caught up. She weaved through the clusters of guests, careful not to bump into anyone, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. As she drew closer, the piano seemed impossibly large, the heiress impossibly beautiful, and the crowd impossibly judgmental. Her palms grew slick, and for a moment, she considered turning back. But then the heiress caught sight of her. The young woman's eyebrow lifted in mild surprise as she took in the girl's simple clothes, the faint smell of cleaning solution still clinging to her. The crowd's conversation softened into a curious hush. "May I try?" the girl asked, her voice quiet but steady enough to carry across the piano's gleaming lid. A ripple of amusement moved through the onlookers. Some exchanged smirks, others shook their heads. The heiress tilted her head, her smile polite but tinged with disbelief. It was the kind of look that said, "You don't belong here," yet there was also a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. The heiress stepped aside with a faint, almost teasing gesture toward the bench. "Be my guest," she said, as though the outcome were already certain. The girl's knees felt weak as she lowered herself onto the seat. For the first time, her fingers hovered over real ivory keys, and she drew in a slow, deliberate breath. The room faded away. The bench felt strange beneath her, smooth, polished, and far too perfect compared to the wobbly stool she was used to at home. Her fingertips hovered above the keys, so pristine they seemed almost too pure to touch. For a heartbeat, she didn't move, letting the quiet stretch. The crowd was restless in its silence, half expecting her to slam out a few wrong notes before shrinking away in embarrassment. She took one slow breath, steadying her racing heart. Then her fingers descended. The first note rang out, clear and resonant, cutting through the soft hum of champagne glasses and murmured disbelief. It was tentative, cautious, as though she were testing the piano's soul. But then the second note followed. And the third, weaving together into a melody that had lived in her for years. Her hands began to move with familiarity, her body leaning into the rhythm, each chord unlocking another piece of the story her mother had once taught her to tell. The music swelled, and something in the air shifted. Conversations died completely. Waiters froze in mid-step, champagne flutes balanced in trembling hands. The girl's posture straightened, her shoulders rolling back as her confidence grew. Her left hand built a deep, rich foundation while her right hand danced over the keys with a grace that seemed impossible from someone in worn shoes and a plain cotton dress. Every note was more than sound, it was emotion distilled into music. There was grief in the way she lingered over certain chords, joy in the light, racing passages, and hope in the rising crescendos. It wasn't just flawless technique, it was the kind of playing that made people feel something in the pit of their stomachs. The song didn't just fill the room, it owned it. She forgot where she was. The chandeliers, the crowd, the polished marble, all of it faded into the background. She could see, in her mind, the tiny living room where she'd practiced in the evenings. She could feel her mother's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, hear her gentle corrections and encouragement. She could smell the faint scent of tea that always lingered on her mother's clothes. Every keystroke was a conversation with someone she loved and lost, a way to bring her back for just a little while. The music built toward its most difficult passage, a rapid, intricate section that would challenge even a professional. A collective breath seemed to be held in the room. The heiress, who had been leaning casually against the piano's side, now stood upright, her arms crossed but her eyes fixed entirely on the girl's hands. There was no smirk on her lips anymore, no trace of mockery, only an unblinking focus. The girl's fingers flew, each movement precise yet fluid, as though the piano were an extension of herself. When the final stretch approached, she poured every ounce of feeling into it, letting the last chords bloom and fade like the closing of a story. Then, silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. It was as though the room had forgotten how to breathe. Then the applause began, not the polite tapping of hands that often followed a dinner performance, but a wave of sound that rose and swelled until it was almost deafening. People stood from their seats, some clapping above their heads, others calling out in praise. She sat frozen, her chest rising and falling with the force of her breaths, her fingers still trembling from the intensity of it all. Only then did she dare to look up, and saw the heiress staring back at her, eyes shimmering in a way the girl had never expected. The final notes still seemed to linger in the air, as if the grand piano itself was reluctant to let them go. The applause roared on, echoing through the ballroom's high ceilings, but the heiress didn't join in right away. She was still staring at the girl on the bench, her lips parted slightly, her eyes fixed not on the piano, but on the way the girl's fingers had fallen limply into her lap, spent, trembling, alive with what they had just done. It took a few moments for the heiress to find her voice. The smirk she had worn earlier was gone entirely, replaced by something softer, almost fragile. She had expected awkward fumbling, maybe a clumsy attempt at the opening bars, enough to get a quick laugh from her friends. What she had heard instead was something she could not laugh at. It had been beautiful, achingly beautiful, and it had pierced through her like an arrow. When the crowd finally began to settle, she stepped closer to the girl, the soft fabric of her gown brushing against the polished wood of the piano. Where, her voice faltered slightly, not used to being uncertain. She tried again. Where did you learn to play like that? The girl looked up at her, startled by the question. For a moment, she hesitated, glancing down at her worn shoes as though unsure if she was even allowed to answer. Then she spoke quietly, her words simple but heavy. From my mother, before she passed away. The room seemed to still again, not in surprise this time, but in respect. Even those who had been ready to scoff now felt the shift in the air. A few guests lowered their eyes, embarrassed by their earlier assumptions. From the doorway, a man in a faded uniform shirt and work boots stood watching, his mop leaning against the wall beside him. It was the girl's father. He had stopped when he heard the first notes, unable to keep working, afraid to miss a single second. Now he stood frozen, his expression caught somewhere between pride and disbelief, his hands clenched into fists as though holding himself together. The heiress's gaze flicked briefly toward him before returning to the girl. Her eyes softened further, and something almost like guilt passed over her face. She realized that she hadn't just underestimated this girl, she had almost robbed her of a chance to be heard. The challenge had been a joke, a performance in itself, meant to make her shine brighter among her friends. Instead, it was the girl in the simple dress who had stolen the light, and the heiress couldn't bring herself to resent it. Applause rose again, slower this time, more deliberate. The heiress, still standing beside the bench, didn't try to reclaim the spotlight. Instead, she let the moment belong to the one who had earned it. She extended her hand, not with the mocking flourish she might have used before, but with sincerity. The girl stared at it for a moment, unsure if this was yet another game, but something in the heiress's eyes told her it wasn't. You played, the heiress said softly, almost to herself. You really played. It wasn't quite praise, and it wasn't quite disbelief, it was recognition. And for the first time that evening, it felt like the heiress and the janitor's daughter stood on the same ground, if only for a heartbeat. The applause faded slowly, like the last ripples of a stone dropped into still water. The girl remained seated at the piano, her hands resting quietly in her lap, unsure of what to do next. Her chest still rose and fell from the effort, her heart pounding with the weight of what had just happened. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her, not in mockery this time, but in something that felt dangerously close to admiration. The heiress stepped forward, the soft sweep of her gown brushing the edge of the bench. She looked down at the girl for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet voice that nevertheless carried across the room, she said, "A promise is a promise." A few people chuckled under their breath, expecting her to twist the moment into another joke. But her tone was different now, there was no trace of the arrogance she'd worn earlier. She extended her hand again, this time with purpose. The girl hesitated, searching the heiress's face for some sign of mockery, but found only sincerity. Slowly, she placed her hand in the heiress's, and the warmth of the touch surprised her. The heiress turned to the crowd. This young woman, she began, her voice gaining strength, is one of the most gifted musicians I have ever heard. And I intend to make sure the world hears her play. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the ballroom. A man near the front tilted his head, clearly intrigued. A woman in a glittering emerald dress whispered something to her companion, eyes wide. The heiress didn't waver. She reached into the small beaded clutch at her side and pulled out a sleek black card. Placing it gently into the girl's hand, she said, "This is my personal contact. Tomorrow, you'll meet with my family's foundation. We'll arrange for you to study with the best, at no cost to you. Music schools, instruments, concerts, whatever you need." The girl's breath caught. Her first instinct was to shake her head, to insist she didn't deserve this, but the heiress squeezed her hand firmly. "You earned it. Tonight, you didn't just play a song, you told a story. And I want the world to hear it." From the doorway, her father's voice broke through the soft hum of the crowd. "Thank you." It was rough, choked with emotion, and barely more than a whisper, but the heiress heard it. She glanced at him and nodded once, as if to say, "You don't need to thank me." The crowd erupted into fresh applause, this time not for a performance, but for a moment they knew they would remember. The heiress helped the girl stand, and together they faced the guests. But the girl wasn't thinking about the audience or the glittering chandeliers or the priceless piano behind her. She was thinking about the years of quiet practice in dim rooms, about her mother's voice urging her to play with her heart, about the calluses on her fingers that no one had noticed, until now. For the first time, she felt the strange, dizzying sensation of a door opening where there had only ever been walls. And as she looked down at the card in her hand, she realized that her life had just shifted on its axis. Not because of luck, not because of pity, but because she had dared to place her hands on those keys and let the music speak.